I'm Caitlin E, and welcome back to the Lit Review. I realize that it's almost the end of February, but I am here to talk to you about my January wrap-up. I actually really like what I read in January and read quite a bit, but I haven't made time to sit down and chat with you all about it, so that's what we're doing today. I am probably going to be looking down, or you might catch glimpses of this little guy here, because I have started using this book journal that I got off of Etsy. I will link it down below in case you're interested in it, but it's just been really helping me actually craft reviews better because of the way it's broken down. If you're interested in hearing more about this journal process, please let me know. I'd be happy to do a video about it. I used to do a lot of stats in the front of my wrap-ups, and I'm not going to be doing that anymore. Basically, what you're going to get from me is a lot of content information, star ratings, that kind of stuff. I will still be collecting all of my stats. I just will be delivering them in a separate video quarterly as opposed to every video, because I realized part of what was stressing me out every month and making me feel guilty or like I wasn't a good enough reader was, as cool as all those stats are, looking at them every month and trying to break down and like fix my reading every month, which came from a really genuine place of wanting to be a more diverse reader, wanting to be a more invested reader. All of those things are still true. So I'm still collecting all of those stats, but it's not as stressful every month to break them down, and I can still make those important changes and pivots like for myself, and I can share them with you, but delivering them in these videos is now not going to be as stressful, which is great. Enough about that. I can tell you that I read 11 books in January, which is a great start to the year. So let's get to them. This might be like a bit superstitious of me, but I tend to think like one of the first books in a year that I read kind of sets the tone, and like I end up really loving almost the first thing I read, which, proved to be true again this year. And the first thing I read in 2022 was The Bride Test by Helen Hoang. Also, I'm going to be testing out this type of visual that I'm adding here on the screen for you. It will have things like spice rating, star rating, the cover. In most cases, I'm doing a lot more e-reading, so the cover, if I can't hold it in front of you, and then tropes and trigger warnings. By no means will either of those things be an exhaustive list. They are just the things that came to top of mind considering the book. So I gave this 4.5 stars. I also gave it 3.5 peppers on my personal heat scale, which means that there was some good spiciness, but I didn't think the frequency or the specific descriptions was enough to like warrant something super extra spicy, but it was very good, very spicy, very steamy. I do think I liked the kiss quotient a little bit better, because I think this is like a companion novel. You can definitely read this on its own, but there are these 3 slightly connected standalones, and this is the second of the 3. So you meet the male main character Kai in the Kiss Quotient. He's a minor character there, and he is the autistic cousin of the main character in the Kiss Quotient, Michael. So again, you kind of get to check in on Michael and Stella just a wee bit in this novel, but you don't need to have read their story to fully appreciate what this book is all about. So with his autism, Kai has convinced himself that he doesn't know how to love, or doesn't know how to feel very, strong emotions based on just like the signals that society is giving him and how he interprets his own body and his own emotions. He's convinced himself of this fact. So he's very anti-dating, anti-marriage, because he's like, well, what's the purpose? I can't love anybody. Why would I do that? Except he has a meddling mother. As one often does. And his mom thinks that she can fix this, so she goes to Vietnam and interviews a bunch of women because she really wants her son to find happiness and to be married. And that's how we meet our female main character, Esme. She's a cleaning woman in the hotel that Kai's mom is staying at, and something kind of sparks for Kai's mom. She's like, you are actually going to be good to my son. And so she convinces Esme to come to America for, I guess, I think it's like 6 months or a summer, and try to seduce Kai. Kai is aware of that plan, so it's not like she's keeping anything from him, and he's he's kind of like reluctantly allowing Esme to be in his space out of care and respect for his mom. But it's really their own emotional journeys. You get both point of views from this. Each of them has their own really in-depth character journey that they go on in this process. And that's one of the things I really, really love about Helen Hoang's writing is the depth of the backstories, the depth of the emotions that come with her characters in a spicy romantic comedy. So big fan of this book. I rated it, again, 4.5 stars. What you can expect in terms of tropes. It has miscommunication in it, which is normally one of my least favorite tropes of all time. However, this is one of the rare exceptions where the miscommunication trope at a plot level makes sense. It makes sense. So I'm not mad at it. It also has kind of like the arranged marriage trope. You will get some cool representation in here. Specifically, there's autism or neurodivergent rep in here with Kai's character. You do get some interesting dialogue about the immigrant experience from both Esme and Kai's family, Asian American and Vietnamese rep from both Kai and Esme. So there's a lot of cool layers to character development and ways that you might feel seen when reading this book, or just feel empathy when reading this book when it comes to representation. When it comes to trigger warnings throughout this review and any of my future reviews, I will be labeling things that come to mind as things that might be considered a trigger warning or a content warning for folks, but there may be things that I don't catch. If so, my apologies. Please make sure to, shout out warnings if you think there's something else in the comments. It's really about creating the best and safe community and going into books, with your eyes open and knowing what you're getting into. Which is not to say that this has a lot of them. There is a really long-standing discussion of grief that I think makes perfect sense for the story. And also Esme in particular has some really poignant issues with abandonment that I think get dealt with in this novel really well. But if abandonment is something that like pushes your buttons, this book's definitely going to do that a little bit for you. But this was such an emotionally driven read. It was also very funny and deeply personal. Great book to kick off my year with. Very big fan. Next, I read a graphic novel called Supreme Blue Rose. This is by Warren Ellis and Tulo Lotte. This was one of the random picks that Jeremy grabbed for me as part of my unwrapping project that you've seen on Litland if you've been tuning into that. This was actually a 2.5 star rating for me, and there's a lot going into why. I did not give this a pepper rating because I don't really think there's a lot of steam or spice there. The thing that I struggled with is how dense. Like it's a little trade bind up of a comic, Like it's thin, and it's not that you can't tell complex or interesting stories here, but this graphic novel thought it was way too clever for its own good. You just got the sense that the writer probably thinks he's better than you, and having done a little bit of digging into the writer, he's definitely got some harassment and or potentially sexual assault allegations against him. The last I googled. So, because they're really riffing on the idea of superhero universes and the way that they get rebooted, which I think as a comic book fan is an interesting premise, don't get me wrong. Especially with things like Marvel and DC being the powerhouses that they are and the way that they can just kind of reboot characters willy-nilly. This book kind of takes that idea of the reboot and asks you, what would actually happen to characters who were endlessly rebooted and who might have memories of former lives? How do they continue to interact with one another? What does that do? But it really falls short of the depth of that potential premise by trying to be clever. When it comes to tropes, there's definitely memory loss or amnesia, the shadowy government agency trope that I think can be kind of fun in action adventures or thrillers. Trigger warnings, I do say gun violence because there is one moment where that's really heavily on the page, but I call that a minor trigger warning. It's not deeply in your face or too impactful. It's not something that I think would prohibit you from reading this book if you're interested. The representation you're likely to get is that there is a BIPOC ensemble cast, which is great. Love to see it, even in books that didn't tick boxes for me. There is some discussion about mental health and what it means to be quote-unquote sane or not. And then there's like a supporting character that has some disability rep. He is wheelchair bound, courtesy of something that happened in like an alternate universe. But it's really minor. It's like a supporting character thing, not something I would really put forward as a huge part of representation for this. So it was doing some good-ish things, which is why I gave it 2.5 stars. But I will not be rereading this. Next, I read Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas. I gave this 3 stars, and I gave it 4 peppers on my personal pepper scale. Definitely gave it 4 peppers for the explicit descriptions as well as the frequency of the steamy scenes. So that's what kind of motivated it to 4 for me. But Punk 57 has been out for a while. It's a new adult romance. I checked it out on Kindle Unlimited. You have 2 pen pals, Misha and Ryan, who have been writing to each other for years, like since they were kids. They live not that far from one another, but they've always kind of kept it at the pen pal level. And over the years, they've kind of fallen for each other. Yet, when there is opportunity for them to kind of secretly meet in person, Misha infiltrates Ryan's school for mysterious reasons and discovers that Ryan is actually not that great of a human, at least to other people in her high school. And so this is a bully romance, and it's almost like mutual bullying, because like Ryan's kind of a bully to other people, and then Misha hardcore bullies Ryan. So it's about when their ideals of who they are and like their real life trauma kind of collide in interesting ways. I will say that I am not sure bully romances are my jam. At least not this type of bully romance, specifically in like a high school setting. Maybe there are other books that will change my mind, but this was just kind of like, it wasn't bad. I gave it 3 stars, which is not at all a bad rating. It wasn't the pot of gold at the end of my rainbow, you know what I mean? Like, it just, So what I found is that Penelope Douglas can be kind of hit or miss for me, but she always pulls me through the novel with her character and her plot. So even if it's not always my thing, she's never that bad for me. So that's why I keep coming back to her as an author. And then the things that she does well, like, wow, does she do them well. I also learned about myself this month that I really don't like this trope that I saw in a couple of books. I think, I don't know what I would officially call this, but for lack of a pithier phrase, it's like when the new kid turns into a bitch to become popular. I'm dating myself here, but I would call that like a Heather's trope. Like it doesn't work for me. And so the fact that that was part of Ryan's like origin story, not good. So in terms of representation, I wouldn't say that this book had much, if any. Just calling that out. The tropes that were there, the bully romance, and then I think you see this sometimes in like high school romances or bully romances in general, like where it's the love pairing is like the cheerleader and the outcast, or like the popular girl and the outcast. So that was definitely in this space. Lots of potential trigger warnings here, content warnings for folks. Bullying, homophobia is just casually thrown around a lot. There's a lot of like misogyny casually as well. Abandonment issues, death of a loved one that impacts one of the main characters pretty heavily. And that's not to say that like if this book is your jam, it was okay. I'm not mad at it. It just did some specific character things that like were not for me. But I do still really like reading Penelope Douglas books, because I feel like every time I read one of her books, it teaches me something about my kinks, my readership. So I always feel like it's a bit of an adventure, and I'm not mad at that. However, then I went even deeper into KU and randomly found the first in what I believe is going to be a new fantasy romance series called Omega Sanctuary by Mira Kane. I have never read an Omegaverse story. I read a couple of fics with it and thought it was just not for me, but something about this premise like really got me to try. This is interesting and a fairly rich fantasy world. So Zara is our main character here, and the entire world is built around the kind of like Omega dynamics, but it's the Omegas that are often like very powerful mages, and they have reverse harems with alphas that like help protect them, keep them safe. But there's also like the betas are just like your average people that help the society keep on keeping on. And so for most of her like her life, Zara has been classified as a beta, and so she loves to bake. She works in her family bakery. She discovers that she's like a late blooming Omega and that she's an immensely gifted one. So her level of power has the potential to greatly impact the society. So she needs to go to the Omega Sanctuary to train and potentially find her alphas to help her like harness her power. So she ends up discovering her own abilities, obviously, and then, like finding some gentlemen to help her meet her other needs. This was a fun ride. I'm going to be honest with you, what drew me in more than anything else was the gorgeous cover. Like, I just thought that was really cool. The fantasy world seemed interesting, and I will say that there's depth to this fantasy world. Yes, you are reading this for the spiciness of the book, 100%, which, by the way, I gave it 4 peppers, both for the explicitness and the frequency. I suspect that future books will probably push to 5, and for some folks, they may want to rate this a 5 on their personal pepper scale. But for me, it was a 4 because a lot of the front half of the book is like world building and like gearing up towards those intimate relationships, but very frequent once it gets going. So I gave this a 3-star, mostly for execution. Like, I really love the premise, and I'm the type of reader that will like give a lot of room for a successful premise in any book. So for me, it was actually kind of the writing that slowly started to let me down, just based on like pacing and some like elements of repetition. But I really loved the characters, and the plot was really cool. The world building has a lot of potential. I will be continuing with this series when the new one releases because I'm invested. And I think when you're looking at these kind of erotic romances on Kindle Unlimited, sometimes it's not the writing execution that gets you, Like, sometimes it's the plot, it's the smut. And I think this one was decently well written, by the way. I don't mean to like completely bash that. I just kind of felt like there were some things that had a lot of potential that just didn't get fully realized, and I won't say too much more because spoilers. There is some LGBTQIA plus rep in here, which is kind of great. And so what I've put up here as one of my potential tropes is MLM, because they're two of her pack. They do refer to it, I think, as pack dynamics. Are actually their own group already, and it's a male alpha and a male omega, and so like she kind of gets entangled with them. So they already have a solid relationship, so you do get to see some of their dynamics as well. But mostly reverse harem. You do kind of get some teasing elements of magic school. I'm hoping that continues in the future series. There's definitely a solid praise kink thing going on in here too. Trigger warnings. There's like some mild fantasy violence, but nothing that I think would cause a strong degree of harm. I will be checking out the sequel when it comes out. It may already be out, but I'm into it. And this was definitely a month of me getting sucked in by pretty covers, so we're going to keep talking about that. Then I hit my first reread of the year. I definitely want to give myself that freedom to do more comfort reads, do more rereads, because that is part of the joy of being a reader. You can tell what kind of mood I was in January, but A Lady of Rooksgrave Manor by Kathryn Moon. This did come up a lot as a recommendation for my Monster Smash video when I asked both here on YouTube and on Instagram, and I had read it prior to this, but I really wanted to reread it, so I did. And it made me very, very happy. My overall rating for this book is 4 stars, though honestly it just kind of lives in my head rent-free, so maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe it is a 5-star read. It's definitely a 5-pepper read. Definitely a 5-pepper, both for like level of kink, frequency, level of explicit writing. I actually really like Kathryn Moon's writing. I feel like she does a really good job of having just enough plot to really keep you captivated among the voluminous amount of smut, which is not a complaint. That is just a statement of joy and fact. But you also get like character growth and character arcs. There is a second book in this world coming out, I think in March, at the end of March, but they're more like companion novels. There might be some hints of of existing characters, but you can read this as a standalone. So highly recommend this. If this is your first time ever hearing about this book, the premise for this is that Esther, our main character, is a maid with a really strong amount of desire, and so she ends up becoming a member of this house that in secret kind of serves the monster or paranormal community as a brothel. But her madam is actually really more interested in finding love matches and people who like are really going to care for one another. So this is another reverse harem, paranormal fantasy kind of vibe. And most of Esther's suitors, her gentlemen, as she refers to them, are of like the humanoid, like intense monster variety. There's like one of her gents that has some like Jekyll Hyde monster type moments, but overall, like it's not, if you're dipping your toe into the waters of monster kink or monster fiction, I think this is a great way to start. I also think what I look for in my romances generally is like the emotional connection, both between characters that then makes me feel emotionally connected to them, and that is 1000% there for me. I love this book. I should probably just admit that this is a 5-star book for me. One of Esther's love interests, August, is a bi vampire who was a pastry chef. He is everything to me that I want it in a romantic main character. Let's talk a little bit more about tropes, representation, and trigger warnings. So again, reverse harem. There's like one scene of sword crossing of two guys being together because again, August is bi. You do have a little bit of like class divide tension since Esther has a lot of insecurities about where she's coming from versus where her gentleman callers are coming from at a class level. There is some voyeurism, and then this does have a few scenes with size kink, but I wouldn't say that this is a book that has a lot of discussion about size kink. Trigger warnings, I will say, for like mild on the page violence, because there's a principal antagonist in here that helps move the plot, and so like there is some issues there. There's like off-screen torture that impacts one of the characters, but not a core part of the plot. It is more just part of the antagonist thing. I don't want to spoil it. But the representation, again, because I read August as bi, I don't think Kathryn like explicitly states it, but he just like has clearly had relationships. So he's bi or pan, potentially, but it's not articulated. But I do think it's clear that there is some LGBT rep, even though it's minor and just limited to one character. But yeah, I've read this twice in the span of like 8 months. So really, really good. Really enjoy. Can't wait for the second one to come out in March. Then I read a really short story that I actually highly recommend that anybody pick up if they're looking for just like something to get them out of a slump. It was my first time I've ever read this author. So this is Xingu by Edith Wharton. I found this one randomly through my library, and I was specifically looking for books that started with an X for my alphabet challenge that I partake in every year. The plot's super simple because, again, tiny short story. But the ladies of a high-class literary society are trying to impress a distinguished visiting author, and it just goes awry. 5 stars. I laughed so hard reading this. The writing was great. It made me want to read more Edith Wharton. I love how it sent up like class and class distinctions and like the pretentiousness that can sometimes happen in book clubs. Like, hi, hello, I run a book club. I also have a booktube channel. I'm sure I've had moments of being pretentious myself, and will probably continue to do so. But I was able to laugh at it because of it, because I just saw so much of like the broad community or like how people choose to interact with books, and it was hilarious. Because of the time and place that it's written in, there's like no representation to speak of. But the trope would be if you're interested in reading about a book club or books about books. I didn't put any trigger warnings on the infographic, but I think if I were to pull back more, I would say like just classism. But to me, it was a funny send-up of classism, so I think it has some impact there. Next, I read 40 Love by Olivia Dade. This is a contemporary romance, and I really ended up enjoying it. I gave it 3.5 stars, with a 4 on my personal pepper scale. So nice spice, very big fan. Would love to read some more Olivia Dade in the near future. This is, I think, again, a companion sort of series. It says there's something about Marysburg novel, but I believe each of the there's something about Marysburg novels are intended to be read as standalones, so don't feel intimidated by, starting in the middle of a series, so to speak. What I really enjoyed about this novel is the characters' emotional range. You got to see them banter, you got to see both of their insecurities, and their emotional growth as they were engaging with one another. It's not just that you saw a character arc, but you could see them struggling through things and processing things in a way that I thought created a really rich interior world for both of the characters. I love a good dual POV, and Lucas, our main character, is just the sweetest. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. This is a love story between Tess and Lucas. 40-year-old Tess is just trying to get some work done in the middle of a relaxing vacation. She's trying to double dip. She's got big plans for her life. But she meets Lucas in the ocean when she loses her top and is terrified of scandalizing some young children who are in the ocean nearby. Lucas comes to her rescue, and there's immediate chemistry between the two of them. Even though Tess dismisses that chemistry because of their age difference, Lucas is also the resort's local tennis pro, has some baggage of his own about his former life as a tennis star. So they both have this immense chemistry, but also some really pivotal turning points in their lives that they're trying to face while figuring out whether or not this is a fling or something more. Legitimately, this is a mild spoiler, so if you do not want to engage with it, then just keep scrolling. But the reason that this is a 3.5 star and not a 4 star for me is one of the smutty scenes involves Tessa's time of the month. And that's just personally a no-go for me, which is not to say that if it works for you or doesn't bother you in the slightest that I'm judging. I'm just telling you it doesn't work for me. So that one scene was enough to make me go, ugh, and knock off half a star. But when we talk about tropes, rep, and trigger warnings, age gap, it's a really cool age gap romance. I love that we're starting to see more age gap where the woman is a little bit older, and then you could also say vacation fling or vacation romance is one of the core tropes for this one. I love that we got to see a 40-year-old heroine in this space. Again, something I don't think we see enough of. I would also say that this, depending on how you like to articulate this is either a body positivity romance, a curvy heroine romance. I know there are a lot of different ways that we can label this as a community. I just kind of want to throw out a couple of different ones, but loved that Tess was a curvy heroine. And then the trigger warnings, I think, kind of come with that representation as well. There's a lot of internalized ageism and fat phobia that Tess faces. And I want to call that out because I think she is genuinely dealing with it and is aware of it, but it's just something that she has to constantly face. And if that's not something you want to read about, just this one's not for you. But I thought it was really elegantly and eloquently done, and it made me really connect with Tess. I will say that. There is some stuff about physical healing for both of them, personal physical injuries and the difficulty and the trauma of that. And then just Tess has experienced some emotional trauma. All of these, I believe, are really minor trigger warnings, but I do want to give you that content heads up just in case those are no-goes for you. Then I read another graphic novel. I picked this one up in December and have been really wanting to get to it. So I read Squad by Maggie Tokuda-Hall and Lisa Sturl. This is a YA graphic novel. This is that trope that I mentioned when I talked about Punk 57, where it's the new girl falls in with the popular crowd and gets kind of mean. But anyway, new girl in town Becca does fall in with the popular crowd and realizes that a lot of their power and popularity stems from the fact that they are also werewolves. Now in this kind of urban fantasy, they're gifted with being werewolves, but in order to maintain their social status and power that comes with being a secret werewolf, once a month they have to eat people. And so it's what I thought was interesting about this book is that how the girls choose to handle that is they go after guys who try to take advantage of them, because in their minds, like, those guys deserve to be hunted down. They don't deserve to be on this earth. So I thought it was like a really interesting take on like pushing back against rape culture that I thought was really interesting to see in a YA graphic novel. I gave this 2.5 stars. I think I probably would have given it 3, but the thing that actually pushed me that half star away is that Becca's love interest ends up delivering a handful of microaggressions to her throughout, and that like really pulled me out and shocked me, and I was like, why aren't the characters addressing this? Becca seems like she's got more more to her than to just let that pass, so it just felt really like strange and awkward, and I didn't like it, and it pushed me out of the story. I also think now granted I'm in my 30s, you know, I own it, I don't feel weird about that. But one of the things that I thought was strange about Squad is that it's set in modern day, but the references felt somewhat dated. Like, I felt like this had more of a story relationship with something like the 80s movie Heathers than it did with, say, Riverdale. I also just generally think the majority of the characters were not nice or good people. Now, I don't think you need to have nice or good people as your central characters all the time. I don't believe that's necessary. But I found it really hard to strongly connect or enjoy the presence of any of them, including Becca, our main character. Now, I will say I did enjoy the color palette for this a lot. I thought the art was really beautiful and interesting, so I did enjoy that. So when it comes to representation, you do have a BIPOC main character. You also have BIPOC supporting characters. So I would say this is a pretty diverse cast for a YA graphic novel. You do have LGBTQIA plus representation. Again, like I said, the mean girls trope, the popular girls, the new girl coming into town to become a popular girl, just like new in school, also keeping secrets. There's definitely like that secret component with the werewolf aspect of this. But I do think it's also worth calling out for content warnings. Like again, it's a strong take on the existence of rape culture, so that is in here. The microaggressions I mentioned earlier, bullying, visual depictions of gore, that one I think is like a moderate one, so if you're just not interested in reading any kind of violence, like just don't. But this is, again, intended for a YA audience, so I don't actually think that's heavily impactful, I just think it's present. I'll admit, I'm a little disappointed in this one, because I wanted to love it so much more. I don't think I'm going to keep this. Then I read 2 Kindle Unlimited romances back to back. Again, the cover got me, but this is Klutz, Phoenix Down by Sedona Ashe. This is another reverse harem paranormal fantasy. I gave this a 3.5 star and a 3.5 on the pepper scale. I think for some folks it's probably going to be more than that, but for me personally, it was the way that the scenes were written that made them not as spicy for me. So our main character in this book, Riles, does not know she is a phoenix. She just knows that she dies a lot and manages to come back. She has like no concept of this broader paranormal world. So as a phoenix, she's a super rare shapeshifter. And when her plane crashes on her way to the Amazon, she becomes stranded with 5 other angsty jaguar shifters that she saves from the wreckage at great cost to her. The cover definitely pulled me in, and I'm very happy to have read this. I gave it 3.5 stars because, again, I think it's a book that has a fantastic premise, but the writing execution somewhat let me down. Now that said, I'm happy to continue consuming these books. I have every intention of reading like the 3rd and 4th book that are coming out later this year. I immediately went into the 2nd book, so that's not a bad thing. I actually think this is quite a fun little novella if you're into reverse harems, if you're into paranormal fantasy romances. Also, holy mother of pearl, what got me in this book at the starting point is the angst. Like, I did not realize I liked angst this much, team. I'll tell you a little bit more about the plots. So these 5 angsty jaguar shifters have been sent by a shadowy government agency to discover the Phoenix and like bring them back into the fold. They have no idea that that is Riles, and Riles, not knowing that she is a Phoenix, has no way of communicating that to them. She doesn't know for most of the novel that they're Jaguar shifters either, so she thinks that, you know, they just happen to survive this crazy plane crash. The Jaguar shifters are a shadow, which is like they're a bonded group, and typically they only have like one mate, and so there's like a lot of angst because they've decided many years ago as a shadow that they will never seek their mate because they want to continue like saving the world and doing good things. But then they realize that Riles is their mate, and so they like try to reject her. And this leads to some of like the best angst on the page from them, and like the way that they bully her and try to like get her to not care about them. I normally do not like bully romances. I just said that earlier in this video, but holy moly was the angst in this good. I would say it's a really fun, quick read with some hefty trigger warnings actually attached to them, and I'll go into that. Because Riles is a phoenix, she dies frequently, so you get like some kind of graphic descriptions of dying. I will say, for me, that was not a huge detractor, but if that's gonna like weird you out, just don't do it. This book is also called Klutz because Riles is like the klutziest being that has ever existed, and I say that as a real life klutz. This made me feel like I was a steady, well-balanced individual. She finds herself in like the worst scenarios. Like anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So as a result, she chooses to unalive herself to speed up her recovery process at one point, and it's like a very traumatic choice because it's witnessed by the shifters who don't understand that she's the phoenix, and so it's like this intense emotional thing, but that's a spoiler. So sorry. There's also the bullying I mentioned. I do think those are content warnings you should know going into this. However, I thought they were things that made this novel better, not worse. But take that under advisement. Again, tropes, reverse harem, the found family of the Jaguars. The grump and sunshine trope is definitely there because there's a couple of particularly grumpy Jaguars, and Riles is just like joyfully, chaotically optimistic, despite the fact that she dies frequently from her own misadventures. There's the survival trope, you know, like they're trying to get out of the Amazon together. There's a lot of angst, there's bullying, there's espionage. So if any of that cocktail of chaos sounds fun to you, I actually highly recommend this as a fun, quick, romantic read. Sorry about that. My camera battery died, so I had to switch to my vlogging camera. We'll see how this goes. But what I was in the middle of saying was that when I go into a Kindle Unlimited romance, I'm expecting a certain amount of explicit content. I'm expecting a certain amount of sizzle for the type of things I like to consume on my Kindle Unlimited. This had elements of that. It was not as spicy as I was anticipating, which was a little disappointing. And I also think like this is maybe just my personal taste. I don't love it when a female main character, especially if you're exclusively in the female main character's head like you are for most of this novel. You do get some of the male Jaguar perspectives, but you're mostly in Riles' head. I really can't handle when the female main character only uses cutesy terms for her body parts. Like, it just annoys the living daylights out of me, especially when it comes to the intimate scenes, because then you get like cutesy names for what's happening instead of explicit content, which, you know, like is what I'm there for in that type of romance. So that's probably what knocked it down to a 3.5 for me at an overall rating, but I do still think this is really fun and worth checking out if you like these kind of romance books. Then, you know, all potential qualms aside, I did really like the first book and like moved myself right along to the second book in the series, which is Klutz Phoenix Heat. The series itself is called But Did You Die? which is hilarious and I think speaks to a lot of the silly humor of the series despite some of its serious content. I gave this book overall 3 stars and a 3.5 on my personal pepper scale for spice. Same issues that I just described apply in this one. The sizzle, the heat is more frequent in how often it shows up, but the descriptions are similarly frustrating based on what I just said about the other book. Without giving too terribly many spoilers for book 1, Riles and the Jaguars are separated from one another at the end of book 1. This book is about where she finds herself, the new mate she discovers along the way, and being reunited with her Jaguars. So that's a very vague plot description, but it's with the intention of protecting you from as many spoilers as I can. I wrote in my book here, I said, my kingdom for a novel and not a novella. Everything in this one felt super rushed. Like, for example, Riles now knows that she is a phoenix, and so her powers went from like, oh yeah, I just regenerate a bunch, to like mega phoenix really quickly, and I felt like there was no space, no development there, which is, you know, cool, but also not as exciting when you want some of that character development. So I still think the concept and the characters are really fun and really engaging, but it just needs more breathing room to develop depth. And I know that I'm going in reading these like kind of fairly short novellas, but I think it's worth calling out, like I did with Xingu, that you can do really cool things in a short amount of time, but you need to consider pacing. So there are things in this novel that just felt so rushed to me at the writing level, but it's still a really fun read. I don't discourage you from reading it at all. This series reminds me so much of the Heart Hassle series by Raven Kennedy, which again is a reverse harem in a fantasy world, but I just think Raven Kennedy did it a smidge better in terms of plot development, in terms of letting things breathe. So I think if you like one of these, you're probably really gonna like the other 2. So if this interests you, go check this series out, and then possibly also go check out Heart Hassle, the Heart Hassle series by Raven Kennedy. You do have a minor character show up that is part of the LGBTQIA+ community, but again, minor representation there. The tropes for this book remain, you know, like reverse harem. You feel even more insta-love here. There's less angst in book 2 than there is insta-love, which I thought was an interesting switch up and didn't work as well for me in terms of engagement, but again, personal choices there. You do still have like that fated mates dynamic even more strongly in this book than in book 1. You start to get elements of chosen one tropes and secret societies as well to the plot, which I think are fun things that, again, I wish I had more time to develop, but they are there. Trigger warnings, you'd get a lot of torture in this book. Riles has really strong abandonment issues, so I don't know why I read so many frickin' books with characters with abandonment issues this month, but I did. And then, of course, because of Riles being a phoenix who constantly dies and regenerates and is very klutzy, like she can barely function without offing herself by accident, death is a potential content warning here. I feel like I'm making it sound like I don't want to continue on with the series, but I really do. I think it's very cute and charming and hilarious. It's not as spicy or as eloquent as I sometimes wish it were at times, but I really enjoyed it and will continue to read it. I hope you give it a chance. And then last but certainly not least, of all the books I read in January, I picked up Moonlight Raider by Amanda Scott. So this showed up in my Bachelor Tarot, or my Romancing the Tarot series that is ongoing. So this is the first thing I read for that. It's a historical romance that I got in a free little library last year or a couple of years ago. But this is my first time ever hearing of this book or Amanda Scott. I had a good time with it. It was a 3-star rating for me. It was a very nice little historical romance. I gave it 2 peppers on my personal pepper scale because there's more tension, I think, than any on the page seduction. Like there's some seductive moments, but it's not a very explicit novel. So I would give this personally for me like 2 peppers max. But I really got through this book super quickly. It was a fun read. I don't always read romance for the spice. Like clearly I just went through a couple of books where that's what I was there for. This time this was way more about plot and character development and the subtle tensions between romantic characters. And I really think that Amanda Scott did that very well. So when we first meet her, Molly, our female main character, is making a desperate Moonlight escape from an arranged marriage that she just doesn't want. She's technically been married, but she rejects it. Basically, she's being chased by her terrible brothers and her awful new husband. Watt kind of helps her evade discovery, and he offers her kind of sanctuary. He's really torn between the duty and his growing affection for Molly. So there's a lot of will they, won't they. There's a lot of mild angst and tension in that regard as they struggle to figure out what they're actually feeling for each other and what they can do about it. So it's a really good character book, and I really thought that it has some cool features in it that I wish more books continued to have. Like, for example, you don't see this a lot in historical romances, which is, I think, a real shame. But you get a map in this. You also get the author's note that really helps you understand how things would be pronounced. I wish more books did this, not just romance novels. But I would say this is a fast-paced, really compulsively readable little historical romance novel. I loved the blossoming relationship between Watt and Molly and the understandable tension that existed between the two. It's a very slow burn romance novel for that reason. It's much more a romance of the mind than the body. Part of what made me give it a 3-star review, and again, I say that meaning that 3 stars is not bad. I think this had potential to be more of a 4-star for me, but I almost wish, I truly wish that the author had removed the existing sex scenes in order to get to that 4-star rating, which is not something I say very often. But here's the thing, the scenes where the two characters are intimate, they're kind of rough. They're not very focused on either person's pleasure or enjoyment of the experience. Their first time together is just to consummate the marriage, and then he goes off to do something else. And so he doesn't finish, she doesn't finish, neither of them have a good time. And I just don't think that was worth adding into the book. You could just tell me behind, you could give me a fade to black that they consummated their marriage, and that would probably have been better for me than the awkward encounter that they ended up having. That said, the overall plot is really enjoyable, and I had a lot of emotional impact. I was deeply invested in these characters. I will say I was bothered by the ending without getting too much into spoiler territory. Her family is not nice. They are abusive, and a lot of this novel is Molly being torn between her sense of deep family duty and trying to defend her brother's behavior or her father's behavior to Watt or other members of that community, and everybody else is kind of gently trying to tell her that they're just awful and that she doesn't need to defend them, and so in the end there's a moment where some of her family gets, I think, an unjustified redemption arc in a way that I don't think it was worth it, especially when Molly is still kind of defending them to other people. I'm no, everything else about their behavior is just bad. They can just be bad people. That's okay. There's not a ton of representation that I would identify. However, Molly does have a scar on her face, and I think it's really interesting to have a scarred heroine in a romance novel, again, because she's been through some abusive situations with her male family members. And I don't think that element was addressed enough in this book. So again, if it has a shortcoming, that's part of it. The tropes that you would experience here are the runaway bride trope, which frankly, I don't think I read enough of. This was fun. The Highlander romance, of course, and then there's the marriage of convenience aspect that comes into play both at the beginning and the end of the plot. But trigger warnings, I've hinted at before, the familial abuse, the fact that she's physically abused, and emotionally abused by her family members. Yeah, not great. It's a minor part of the book, but I'm probably more sensitive to it because it really stood out to me on the page. There is kidnapping and mild violence on the page. However, all the nice things I said about it still apply. So I do think this is worth checking out. But yeah, this is the last thing I read in January. Holy smokes. Okay, that was a lot of stuff. I talked a lot. Gotta get back into the swing of doing wrap-ups here. Wow. So I had a lot of feelings, clearly, about the things I read in January, but that's because I think it actually was a really fun reading month for me. A lot of self-discovery, a lot of things I liked, things I didn't like, but now I know. And hopefully this was helpful for you finding out whether or not you would like to give these books a try too. Thank you for spending time with me. I hope you have a fantastic reading day. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me or this channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!